Hello, Professor Wheeler. As a New Yorker, I love food. Food is one of those things that you can enjoy alone or in a big group. It can cheer you up when it's one of your down days or it gives you the opportunity to bond with your friends and family. And New York is one of the best places for food. You can find almost every type of cuisine in this one city. However, although New York is known for their food selections, how many horror stories have you heard about restaurants in the city? Toenails in your noodles, maybe a whole thumb in your chili, and don't forget about rat sightings. New York is known for their rats. Big, cat-sized, subway rats, and sometimes we question if they're mutated from all the rat poison in the subway. And rats also love food. So, since I like my food, sans toenails, thumbs, and rats, I created this dashboard. I wanted to pinpoint the areas with the most violations, and I wanted to see the trends in food violations in the city. I wanted to know which restaurants I shouldn't go to. So starting off with the data, I found my data set on New York City's open data site, as you can see. Here is the data that I am using in this project. It is a really large data set. So I had exported it into an Excel sheet, and here is the data. At first I deleted some of the columns because I wanted to try and downscale it. However, I kept a lot of the data to give myself more options when executing the actual project. So you can see there's the vendor name, borough, building, and I created it as a table, so I also named all of the columns. I also created an additional column and called it violation over here. Because every violation was not explicitly said yes or no, I wanted to be able to find an easy count of that. So that's why I created this, and I used a formula saying if the action said that there was a violation to say yes, and if it said no, then it was a no. So here is my dashboard. And before I go into depth here, let's go behind the scenes and understand how this came to be. So for the power maps, I wanted to get a quick visual of which borough has the most violations. And of course, ideally, Manhattan would because it has the most dense population. But I wanted to see it in relation to other boroughs. So to execute this power map, I created a pivot table. And I wanted it by boroughs, so in rows, I clicked over and put boroughs in rows. And I put violations in values because I wanted the count. So here's the count of the violations. However, I realized that in violations, it is a yes or a no. And I only wanted vendors that violated some sort of regulation. So I added the violation into filters. And I also included the inspection date so that you can go by year for a more specific if you want to narrow it down. And if we go back to the dashboard, we have a visual of that. And I had used big maps for this and just connected it to the data, back to the Power Map data. So next is the annual violations. And I wanted to display the amount of violations annually per borough. So in rows, I had the inspection dates, but originally it displayed every single date with the month. So what I did was I right-clicked and went to group, and I just set it to years. So it was a bigger picture. And so afterwards, I put boroughs in columns so I can see the count for each borough, and I put the count of violations in the values. And like before, I also put violation into filters so I can filter a yes or a no. And we can see that over here in the dashboard. As for in violation types, I wanted to see the vendors that had violations, whether they were critical or not. So I categorized it by borough in the rows, and I also added the vendor names underneath. So if you expand this, you can see the names of the restaurants and how many critical or non-critical violations they had. And then I got the count of the critical violations by putting the critical flag into the values and then simply putting it in the column so you can see what type of violation it was. And you can see that over here. And lastly, for the dashboard, I wanted to show a quick trend line of the amount of violations from 2012 to 2016. So I put the inspection date under rows, and like I did in the annual violations, I grouped the data into years by doing grouping and then into years instead of having every single date individually. And then I just put the violation count into the filters and values so that we can see how many violations were made per year. And so we see this trend of violations over here. So on the right here, I have inserted slicers to narrow down specific data. I included the violation slicer as an option for the user to see how many vendors don't have violations. Because remember, the goal here is to find restaurants that do not have violations so we know where to eat. And so if you click no, it simply shows for these two, for annual total violations and trend of violations, or vendors without violations. So we'll just go back to yes. And then I also included the inspection date so that you can see per each year instead of just a whole. And so for inspection date, it affects the annual total violations and the violation types per borough. And for borough and cuisine description, it affects all of the charts. So if you wanted to see the trend of Bronx, you can see that over here. And it's critical, non-critical over the years. And then you can also pick what type of food you want, or if you want multiple types of food, like how did they fare over the years. And so lastly, to finish off this Excel, I also created a Power View chart. I wanted to view each restaurant's grades and how they got that grade, so I included the vendor name, the inspection date, grade, and violation description. And also in the table, I included borough and cuisine description so that you can narrow down what you're looking for. If I just wanted restaurants in Brooklyn, and I can see each year that they were graded and how they fared. And if I just wanted Australian food, then I would have that here. And throughout this entirety of this project, I found slicers to be extremely useful. I knew they existed, but I never used them in a project. And they easily filter and help categorize data so quickly. And initially I didn't realize how useful they were until I was working on one of the pivot charts and didn't want the user to go back into pivot table to filter out data because it wouldn't be efficient and it would be confusing. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.